Recently, the automotive industry has suffered greatly during the current pandemic. Automakers will be watching very carefully how they spend their money going forward. How should they view this roadmap in terms of being creators and investors themselves?
It's very interesting times for many of us, and I think if you look at the traditional automotive sector, very much bound up in manufacturing, and we all know the challenges that they've been facing recently. And I think somewhat understandably, there's a lot of focus right now on the immediate challenges ahead. If you think, if I were to put myself in the shoes of one of the major automotive manufacturers, you have very interesting challenges ahead in terms of the impacts of COVID, coming out of lockdown, what a kind of a post-lockdown world looks like, how you make up for lost time, the impacts of loss of productivity over the last 6 months or so. You have big challenges around the net zero agenda. So quite rightly, government setting out mandated requirements about how we drive down and drive towards zero carbon transport, move to electrification as one example of how they do that. That's up there as a priority. There's interesting discussions around what Brexit means to the UK manufacturing economy, and that's just three things that the automotive manufacturers are having to deal with right now, and rightly so, that's a focus. But I think what's interesting is sometimes we can get very focused on the challenge of today and the disruption of today, that we don't necessarily appreciate that there's future disruptions coming ahead. And as we solve these and we get back to where we were a few years ago as a automotive industry, there is big investment across the globe coming in from lots of the big money coming in from the tech giants in the States, lots of investment in Asia and in China, in these new disruptive technologies, the autonomy and the connectivity. And if we only take a short-term view, we're storing ourselves up, problems for the future. We may be fragile to future disruptions. So the conversations we're having with those organisations is that the roadmap helps you to start understand when those things are coming along, and help you to know in advance and begin to prepare for these things that are coming in the future. So we can lay out and have an understanding of, when will we see connectivity come on board in a meaningful way? When do we think government is ready to allow the scale up of high levels of autonomy in vehicles? And that helps those organisations prepare in advance to say, this is only a few years away. If we look at sort of 2025 as our transition point in the roadmap, that's the point at which we expect to begin to see the scale up in deployment of vehicles, because the environment is ready. Legislation will be in place, the connectivity will be there, the understanding from highways authorities and others about how to manage them. That thinking will have been done. So rather than having to deal with the here and now problems and then just wait for the next disruption, the roadmap allows all organisations, and it doesn't just, constrain to the automotive sector, but everyone, to say, actually, here are things you need to be considering in the medium to long term, because if we don't consider them now, we are fragile and brittle in some senses to those future disruptions. So that's what we're working with the roadmap and with those organisations to show that there are big challenges today, and we must address them. And absolutely, for many, they will remain the focus in the very short term. But to look into the medium-term horizon and recognise that there is big global competition in the space, which in 5 to 10 years' time, we don't want to have lost the opportunity in the UK to grasp that and to maintain that with the front runners in this sort of race to unlock the benefits, both societal and economic, of connected and automated mobility in the future.
Thank you. My final question, The COVID-19 pandemic has allowed people to pause, think about how they use transport and how they will use transport in the future. Does this roadmap take into account these views and the shift to multimodal transport?
Yeah, it's one of those sort of interesting topics that everybody, as we've been speaking to people over the recent months, as we came up to our most recent release, looking at, what is the impact of the pandemic and the long-lasting impacts, because we can probably understand the impact of a lockdown and what that's had in terms of productivity and economy, etc. But do we understand how this might substantially change travel patterns in the future? So in our latest release, we're kind of addressing the views of our industry as how we perceive that the future might be. I don't think any of us has a crystal ball that we can speak for the entire of the travelling public about how their movements might change. But I think what we do recognise and understand is there are some major trends. So working from home, will undoubtedly be one of the lasting effects, I think, of the pandemic. The need for people to travel all at the same time on the transport network, to all commute in at 9 and back home at 5, will probably be dissipated in some senses. We also know when we think about mass transit and whether that's trains or buses, right now there is a reticence and actually advice to avoid those types of transport modes at the moment and move to potentially more active travel, walking and cycling where you can, etc. Will that last? Will that continue to be a long-lasting trend? I think we're less clear on whether that will be the case. So we went out to those 120 people who contributed to our latest update and said, well, what do you think these long-lasting impacts of COVID will be? And the report that we've just released kind of seeks to summarise a lot of that information. I think when we think about the impact on multimodal transport, I think what will be interesting is the impact that has on the shared element of travel, as I mentioned already. Often when we talk about future of mobility, we use the CASE acronym, to connected, automated, shared and electric. And I think the shared element of that will be interesting to see how people view that in the future. Will we see a push to more and more people going back to the kind of COVID secure bubbles of their own vehicles? You're traveling in your own vehicle to you park up somewhere. If we see a rise in that, it'll be interesting, the impact that might have on things like parking and actually congestion on the roads, etc. So I think, the multimodal aspect of transport and understanding, when do you drive or when do you go on a bus or a train? I think time will tell exactly how that will unfold. And the roadmap itself, when it sets out, this vision of the future, what we haven't done is radically altered everything within the roadmap to say, as a result of the pandemic, all bets are off and everything's changed. In the short term, clearly, the activities over the last year and probably this coming year inevitably will be impacted by the effect of the pandemic. But our analysis has said broadly, from a medium to long term, the vision, needs to remain the same, because what we're looking at is the deployment of connected and self-driving technologies into the transport system to deliver relatively broad sets of benefits. Now, whether that's exactly all in personal vehicle ownership or public transport or freight, the roadmaps try not to be overly specific, because 10 years out, I'd say your guess is as good as mine. The roadmap, guess, if you like, is based off 250 people's expert opinion. So I'm certainly confident it's more than a guess. But still, that far out, many things can change. And when we started, the roadmap, the concept of a pandemic locking the entire world down for 6 months would not even been, a consideration. And if someone suggested it, we'd have probably laughed it off as something that would never happen. So at 10 years out, we've decided to set an aspirational goal. That remains the same. And the second half of the roadmap, right now, we think broadly is still the way it will pan out. What we're paying attention from, and the reason we have a continual update process of the roadmap, is to say, in the shorter term, as we start to see, as we hopefully come through the pandemic and we ride possibly a number of waves, but we start to see the longer term impact. At that point, we will then look at the roadmap and say, actually, do we understand with better certainty now what the short to medium term future will be? But we remain our eyes are fixed on the 2030 vision of a safe and successful deployment of connecting self-driving mobility, delivering fairer access to transport, increased productivity with generating environmental benefits by being closely aligned with the net zero electrification agenda, but also then placing the UK at the centre of this kind of global opportunity with high value jobs, a strong supply chain, and delivering that thought leadership. All of that remains our ambition, and time will tell in the short term whether the path through the roadmap that each of us will be taking is affected.
Thank you, Mark. That was Mark Cracknell from Zenzic. Thank you for a fascinating insight into the UK connected and automated mobile roadmap. Thank you for watching this GSMA IoT WebTalk. Thank you.